In the spring of the year 845, Paris was not a city expecting war. It was a settlement shaped by routine, by trade, and by the slow certainty of medieval life. The river Seine flowed steadily beside wooden houses, stone churches, and narrow streets where merchants called out to familiar faces. Boats arrived carrying grain, wine, cloth, and news from neighboring regions. Rarely anything unexpected. For the people who lived there, danger was something distant. Conflicts belonged to faraway kingdoms, to borders they would never see. The rhythm of their lives was governed not by fear, but by the tolling of church bells, the opening of market stalls, and the turning of the seasons. Morning began as it always did. Smoke rose from hearth fires. Fishermen prepared their nets. Traders arranged their goods with the same care they had shown the day before and the day before that. Nothing in the air suggested that history was approaching. And yet, beyond the horizon, beyond the gentle bends of the Seine, something had already begun, moving toward them. It did not come with messengers. It did not declare itself with banners. It came silently, carried over cold northern waters, guided by currents older than any kingdom in Francia. Long before anyone in Paris understood what was happening, the journey had already begun. And it was drawing closer. The first sign was not seen in Paris itself, but farther downriver. Villagers along the Seine began noticing shapes on the water that did not resemble the trading vessels they were accustomed to. These ships were longer, lower in the water, built for speed rather than burden. Their movement was deliberate, smooth, almost unnatural compared to the heavy cargo boats of the region. At first, there was uncertainty. Perhaps they were merchants from a distant land, perhaps explorers. No one could say for certain, because no one had seen ships quite like them before. Their hulls were narrow and flexible, crafted to travel not only across open sea but deep into rivers, into places never meant to receive seaborne visitors. Then came the realization that these ships were not drifting. They were advancing. Rowed by crews moving in perfect rhythm, their oars entered and left the water without chaos, without hesitation. There was no shouting, no wasted motion. Only the steady sound of wood against water, repeated again and again, carrying them inland. News traveled slowly in the 9th century, but unease traveled faster. By the time word began to reach Paris, that unknown fleets had entered the river. The ships themselves were already closer than anyone imagined. What approached was not an army in the traditional sense. It was something far less familiar and far more unsettling. By the time certainty replaced rumor, the fleet was already visible to those watching the river. They did not appear as a chaotic swarm, nor as the kind of force Frankish soldiers had trained to confront. There were no armored cavalry riding ahead, no heralds announcing demands, no siege engines dragged across land. Instead, the ships arrived in formation, controlled, measured, and eerily calm. Each vessel seemed alive in the water. Carved prows cut through the current with practiced ease, their design meant for journeys far longer than this one. These were not ships built for a single campaign. They were the product of generations who understood the sea not as a barrier, but as a road. The people of the region had heard stories, of course. Stories of northern raiders who struck monasteries along distant coasts. Stories carried by traders who spoke of sudden attacks and vanished settlements. But stories often feel smaller than reality. easier to dismiss, easier to place somewhere safely far away. Now, those stories were no longer distant. They were rowing steadily toward the heart of the kingdom. Messengers were sent ahead in haste, riding toward Paris, with warnings that struggled to capture what they had seen. How could they explain ships that moved like rivercraft, but had come from the open ocean? How could they describe warriors who navigated inland as confidently as any local fisherman? Even before the fleet reached the city, it had already achieved something powerful. It had replaced disbelief with fear. Paris, in the 9th century, was not the vast capital we imagine today. It was smaller, more fragile, built largely upon the Ile de la Cité, an island that offered natural protection, but not invulnerability. Bridges connected it to the riverbanks, wooden structures that served commerce in peaceful times, yet could quickly become points of danger when threatened. The city relied on its position, on the assumption that distance and reputation would discourage enemies from ever reaching it. That assumption was about to be tested. As news spread, tension replaced the ordinary rhythm of life. Markets closed earlier than usual. Church leaders gathered in hurried discussion. Local defenders attempted to organize resistance, though few truly understood what kind of force they were preparing to meet. This was not a neighboring lord seeking tribute. This was an unfamiliar culture, arriving by water, unconcerned with the expectations of Frankish warfare. The fleet did not rush. It advanced patiently, as though time itself were an ally. Oars continued their steady rise and fall. Shields lined the sides of the ships, not yet raised for battle, but present. Silent evidence of what could follow. For those watching from the banks of the Seine, the most unsettling detail was not aggression. It was confidence. Whoever these men were, they had come a great distance, and they had not come by accident. When the fleet finally reached the outskirts of Paris, there was no dramatic announcement of its arrival. No horns echoed across the river. No immediate assault followed. Instead, the ship slowed, adjusting to the current as if studying the city before them. Their presence alone was enough to send waves of panic through the population. From the walls and riverbanks, Parisians watched in uneasy silence, trying to understand the scale of what they were seeing. Dozens of longships rested upon the Seine. Each one carried warriors hardened by journeys across cold seas and unfamiliar lands. Their shields, painted in muted colors, hung along the sides like silent warnings. Their crews did not shout or boast. They prepared with an unsettling calm, checking ropes, adjusting weapons, observing the city with the patience of men who knew fear could work in their favor. Inside Paris, urgency replaced denial. Defenses were reinforced as quickly as possible. Guards were posted along the bridges. Religious processions moved through the streets, prayers offered not for victory, but for survival. The city had faced hardship before: famine, political struggle, local conflict. But this felt different. This enemy had not come to negotiate boundaries. They had come from beyond the known world. And now they were here. The psychological weight of the arrival was as powerful as any weapon. For generations, the rivers of Francia had been lifelines, routes of commerce, travel, and communication. They were never imagined as corridors through which an invading force could glide directly into the kingdom's interior. Yet the Vikings had transformed geography itself into an advantage. Their mastery of both sea and river allowed them to bypass the very systems meant to protect cities like Paris. Fortifications designed to stop armies marching across land offered little resistance to ships that simply appeared where no army was expected to be. This realization spread slowly but relentlessly among the defenders. They were not facing a familiar siege. They were confronting a new kind of warfare. Outside the city, the Norse warriors began establishing their presence along the banks, moving with deliberate efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no reckless display. Every action suggested experience, raids carried out before, strategies refined over years, confidence built not on hope, but on repetition. To the people of Paris, the waiting became almost unbearable, because the longer the silence lasted, the more certain it felt that something inevitable was about to begin. What followed was not a single moment of destruction, but a realization that unfolded hour by hour. The defenders of Paris prepared for resistance, yet they understood the imbalance before any clash truly began. The Vikings were not testing the city. They were demonstrating that they could reach it at all. That alone reshaped the nature of power along the rivers of Western Europe. Negotiation, fear, calculation, all of these now moved as silently as the ships that had carried the invaders there. King Charles the Bald, ruler of West Francia, faced a decision that would define the encounter. A prolonged conflict risked devastation not only to Paris, but to the fragile stability of his kingdom. The Vikings, on the other hand, did not require conquest in the traditional sense. Mobility was their strength. Pressure was their weapon. Gold, silver, and tribute became the language through which violence might be delayed. It was not a glorious solution, but it was an effective one. The payment offered to the Norse leaders was immense by the standards of the age. A ransom not merely for a city, but for time itself. Time to rebuild, time to adapt, time to understand an enemy who did not fight by familiar rules. And so the confrontation ended, not with a final battle cry, but with a transaction that echoed far beyond the riverbanks. When the fleet finally withdrew, it did not leave behind a conquered city. It left behind a changed world. Paris still stood. Its churches still held their relics. Its markets would open again. To an observer arriving weeks later, life might have appeared to return to its ordinary course. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the minds of those who had witnessed the event. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Rivers were no longer just trade routes, and the north, once a vague direction on a map, had become a source of calculated, navigable power. The Viking raid of 845 was not remembered solely for what was taken, but for what it revealed. It exposed the reach of Scandinavian seafaring, the vulnerability of inland kingdoms, and the beginning of an era in which Europe would have to rethink how it defended itself. The longships disappeared the same way they had come. Slipping back along the Seine, carried by the current, their passage gradually swallowed by distance. But the memory of their arrival did not fade so easily, because history is not always written in the noise of battle. Sometimes it is written in the silence that follows, and in the understanding that the world has become larger and less certain than it was before.